Welcome to Fatima Today. Our special guest today is Colleen Hammond. She's been with us before, and I'm welcoming back to the program.
Thank you, Father.
And you were telling us about your own conversion and your first confession in years after you went to the abortion clinic. Perhaps you can tell us what happened after that in your life and with your family, for that matter.
Well, it was an interesting time, really, for our marriage. At the time, we'd only been married for a few years, and when my husband and I were married, he was a pagan and I was away from the faith, so there was no, God wasn't involved in our life, and we didn't have a church, we didn't have anything like that. So after I almost got the abortion and then left, and then went to confession, all of a sudden this love for my faith came back, and things that it's kind of, you look back at your childhood and there's fond memories from your childhood, but these were deeper than just fond memories. This was a real stirring in my soul of something I really wanted to learn more about. But of course I hadn't, as we talked about before, I hadn't learned anything about my faith. So my poor husband, when I went in to get the abortion and told him I'd be out 4 hours later, I came out half an hour, 45 minutes later, and then I went in for the confession. I said I'd be back in a couple of minutes, come back a couple of hours later. Yes. Well, I think he knew at the time something was up. We drove home, and suddenly I started going to daily Mass. I started going to Mass every Sunday, where we used to go out and party on Saturday night and sleep in Sunday mornings. Now I was not going out Saturday nights anymore. I was getting up and going to church Sunday mornings. So it was a rough time for our marriage. I mean, this was not the woman, he didn't marry a nun. He had no intentions of marrying a nun, and suddenly that's what he found himself in this situation. So I figured the best way out of that was just to make him Catholic. And then we could go on merrily in our lives and everything would be perfect and fine and there would be no trouble. So I decided to make a deal with God before I didn't know you're not supposed to do that kind of stuff. So I just told God, and I think that's the operative word. I told God what to do. I said, I'm going to go to Mass every day and offer it for my husband's conversion, and I'm going to say the rosary every day and offer it for my husband's conversion. And since God created the universe and the butterflies and Pluto and everything, I figured that this would be easy for him. And so I said, I'm going to do this for 1 year, and at the end of 1 year, you make Dennis Catholic. And so I thought I had a good deal going. All I had to do this was for 1 year, and God would answer my prayer, just like I told him to do. So I started going to Mass and Mass every day, confession once a week, rosary every day, and offering it for my husband's conversion. And I explained to the priest the deal I had made with God, and he just laughed at me. He didn't say anything else. He just kind of laughed, But it was interesting because a couple of months later, my husband said, now, I'm not going to become Catholic or anything, but I want to ask you some questions. Why does the church teach that you can't use a birth control pill? I said, I don't know. So I went and asked my priest. He explained it to me. I thought, oh, that makes sense. So I went back. It was just common sense. I went back and explained it to my husband. He went, that makes sense. Well, maybe the Catholic Church was right about one thing. Yes. So then he asked me another question, and I didn't know the answer. So I went to the priest and asked him, and then turned around and came home and told my husband, and he went, wow, that really makes sense. Well, this went on for a couple of weeks, and finally the priest just said to me, why don't you just send him to the, what they called the RCIA class, the Rite for Christian Initiation or something, and, for people that want to convert to Catholicism. I said, oh, okay. Well, then I thought, well, I better go and protect him, from this class. I didn't know my faith. I don't know what I thought I was thinking, but I think it was our Lord and Our Lady just protecting me, oh, she's so cute, just send her to the class. So I was sitting in the class with my husband, and I was learning a lot for the first week or two. And then, after that, it was a lot of fluff and like washing rocks. And, we were back to what they did for confession was they let go balloons. They would fill balloons with helium and let them go. And so I said, gosh, I washed rocks when I was a kid, So 1 week, it was at the end of November, 1 week the deacon who was teaching the class announced that, okay, next week, in the next couple of weeks, we have the Feast of the Immaculate Conception is coming up, and that's a holy day of obligation. So he kind of talked about holy days of obligation and how Catholics would be coming to Mass. Now, you people are converting, so you don't necessarily have to come, but so he was talking a little bit about it, and my husband raised his hand. He said, well, what is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception? What is that? What does that mean? And the deacon thought for a minute, and he said, well, that's when Jesus was conceived. Yeah. Well, my husband was an academic All-American, the valedictorian of his senior class, and he was a very bright man. And he kind of raised his hand and he said, December 8th, December 25th. That's not 9 months.
Yeah.
And the deacon thought for a minute and he went, well, that's what makes it so immaculate.
Yeah.
So I went, wow. And so Dennis was complaining all the way home. He goes, well, that was the dumbest thing I have ever heard. I kind of thought this Catholicism was a good thing. Now I'm beginning to question this whole idea because that's stupid, I said, well, I don't know, maybe it was a miracle. And he goes, it just doesn't make sense. So I looked it up when we got home and I went, well, here's the problem. It's not when Jesus was conceived, And he went, well, that guy, he's supposed to be high up in the church and he doesn't even know that? Yeah. So I said, well, I don't know. Maybe what we should do is pull out the Baltimore Catechism. Yes. So my husband learned his faith and I learned my faith the next couple of months by studying the Baltimore Catechism. What's kind of interesting is that I think God kind of thought I was a sweet little munchkin or something, and even though I made this deal with God, and I'm really not supposed to, within 6 to 8 months, my husband had been confirmed and baptized into the faith.
Oh, that's very good, very good.
So we really lucked out on that one.
Well, I think that God was pleased with your confidence in Him. I mean, that the fact is, we can't, of course, command God. God is God, and we're His subjects, we're His creatures. But all the same, it was a petition. You were doing something. Obviously, you were doing a rosary, daily mass, daily rosary, and confession every week. I'm sure He was pleased with all that. And secondly, that He was pleased with your confidence that and after all, God wants all men to be saved. God wants all men to become Catholic. And so it's not like you were asking for, I don't know, $1 million or asking for to win the Super Bowl or whatever it is. You were asking for something right. Serious and something close to His heart. After all, His Son died on the cross to save our souls and to bring us to heaven. So yes, we have to be careful in our attitude to God, but not to sort of say, oh well, you're going to do this because I've done my part as I drew up the contract. It's not exactly, but at the same time, there's a lot of benefit. I mean, I can see that certainly you had the confidence, you asked for the right thing, and you did the right things not that we couldn't do even more, but you did the right things to achieve what you wanted, and God wanted to give it to you anyway, obviously, and to your husband for that matter. So, but the Baltimore Catechism, I think we talked about that a little bit. The Baltimore Catechism has been approved by the Vatican. The Baltimore Catechism comes from the Council of Baltimore. The Second Council of Baltimore, that was all the bishops of the United States meeting in Baltimore, which was the see at the time that was the most principal see of the Catholic Church. In I forget the year, but it'd be 1850s or 1870s, something like that. Anyway, the Catechism was drawn up, sent to the Vatican, approved as an accurate description and questions and answers. And so the Baltimore Catechism is still valid to this day. It still teaches the faith, and obviously much better than the poor deacon that you had teaching you. I mean, it's a common enough error for people who don't really know, that the Immaculate Conception is December the 8th because that's 9 months before Our Lady's birthday, which is September the 8th, and that Our Lady was conceived immaculately, that is without the stain of original sin. And of course, our Lord was conceived without original sin on the Feast of the Annunciation. But I mean, that goes almost without saying. We don't. But in fact, but you can't say it's a conception because He had a beginning. He had no beginning. In fact, as God, He had no beginning, and as man, he's a human He's a human nature, but a divine person. So He didn't start on the day that the angel announced His human life started, but He Himself always existed, and therefore, of course, sinless. Whereas Our Lady did start the 9 months before. I mean, she conceived. The conception, beginning, was 9 months before her birth, and when she was conceived without original sin, and that's why we celebrate it. Of course, that's God's designs are, all the things that we have. Everything, first of all, comes from God, and that Our Lady is the greatest of all the saints that ever have been or ever will be. She's greater than all the angels, and the angels have phenomenal sanctity, but Our Lady is still greater than they are. But that's all she would say, the first to say, my soul magnifies the Lord. It's God who's done these things for me. It's not me who's done these. But we have to cooperate. That's the other part of it. We have to cooperate. And of course, she cooperated perfectly. So you were telling me about your husband became a Catholic then, even though he said he wouldn't become Catholic. Obviously, God's grace is stronger than the plans of men. So, but after that, what happened in your life and your married life? I think your first child came shortly after that. Is that?
Yeah, I think I was pregnant at the time. So our oldest son, Ian, was born at right around that time. And I was a businesswoman. I was working, at the Weather Channel, negotiating to take Willard Scott's place at the NBC Today show. I had a contract and was all set and ready to go. I mean, I was ready to sign the contract. My agent had been working to sign the contract. And it was just before my son was born. And they wanted me to fly up to New York City. They wanted me to take a 2-hour flight when I was 9 months pregnant. And my doctor said, no, you get on a plane right now, you'll give birth on the plane. Yeah. So I said, well, we don't want any part of that. So I ended up not flying to New York to sign this, multi-million-dollar contract. And shortly after that, my son was born. And I just looked down at him and I thought, I can't leave him. Now, I fully intended to take my 6-week leave. It would work out wonderfully with the contract. I could transition from one job into the next one. I'd take 6 months off, and then I would just move into my new job, hire an au pair, have somebody taking care of the baby, and everything was fine. But the moment he was born, I looked down at him and I thought, no one's touching this child. I mean, even to the point where I was holding him and I had him all wrapped in the blanket, and my husband leaned over my shoulder and he reached to move the blanket out of the way, and I said, don't touch him. I had no idea that all these protective feelings would rise up in me. So I didn't return my phone calls to my agent. I thought, I can't go back to work. I have to stay home with the baby. What was I thinking, And so I ended up not taking the job. And my husband and I said, we can make it. We'll just redo the budget. We can do, because he had a very good job, making really good money. And he said, we'll just sell a boat, sell a couple of cars, get rid of a house or two, sure. Kind of downsize a little bit, and, everything will be fine. So we did, and things were working out quite well, and I thought, wow, this is great. My husband's going to Mass with me. We're praying the rosary together at night as a couple. We have this newborn child. Yes. We've got a beautiful home. He's got a great job. Life cannot get any better than this, Right. And then we had a visitor, someone who came who did not tell us that their child had meningitis. And after she left, she called us back and said, oh, well, my son just got over meningitis, and, it could be a very fatal disease for a baby. Well, here I have a newborn. And so we were worried, and my husband and I were terrified that our child had, contracted this horrible disease. And we were very lucky that he did not. But my husband did. So my husband, who was in sales, and he was making all this commission, so he had to work to get paid, was out of work for 3 months, was in the hospital, almost died. We racked up all these medical bills and everything, but we thought, well, thankfully he still has insurance, because of this job. What we didn't know was as soon as his company found out that he was going to be out of work for 2 to 3 months, they laid him off and they canceled the insurance. So when he got better and went to go back to work, not only did he not have a job, all of these medical bills started coming to us that you don't have insurance, now you have to pay us cash for 2 months in the hospital, all these procedures and everything. Well, we couldn't afford it. So we had to declare bankruptcy. We had all of our creditors come to the house and repossess cars, left us one car, left us the house, took all of our furniture, took everything we had, racked up on credit card bills or whatever it is, pretty much gutted the house. And they all came on one day and repossessed everything on the one day. And my husband at that point had found another job, and he was at work, so I was home alone with the baby. And they emptied out the house and left us with a good car, anyway, one that worked. They took the bad one away. And I looked around the house, and it was an empty shell. There was nothing. I didn't even have furniture left to sit on. And so I'm sitting on the floor, nursing the baby, and I started to cry, and I cried, and I cried, and I cried till I didn't have any more tears left, and I just kept crying, and finally just cried myself to sleep. I laid down on the floor with the baby, and that's where my husband found me, was on the floor when he came home from work. And he came back into the house, and I woke up, and I started crying again, and he got down on the floor with me, and he put his arm around me, and I said, what are we going to do? We've got nothing. We're on government assistance, we're on food stamps and Medicaid. What are we going to do? And he just hugged me and smiled, and he goes, that's okay. We have each other, we have our health, and we have our faith. What more do we need? So it kind of goes back to what you had said about God honoring, these innocent, petitions, almost like the faith of a child. Well, he was new to the faith, and he had that faith of a child.
Yes.
He just kind of shrugged it off. He said, it's all right, we have each other, we have our health, we have our faith. What more do we need? And how much more we should hold on to that now.
Yes.
That just because bad things happen to you doesn't mean God's mad at you.
No. The other thing is that, and I think it also reprioritizes your values. Obviously having God, having each other, and having health. These are the most important things you can have. And you had a roof over your head, which is, even though it was empty, it was still over there. But all these things, everything God gives us is all providence, and we should be grateful for what God gives us. As Job said, God gives and God takes away.
Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Yes.
Right. And that we didn't quite understand at that time, because both of our lives have been so wrapped up in the culture. He was a successful businessman who had a chance to be a professional athlete. I was the beauty queen and the television star. And our whole life was wrapped up into what the world had told us was important. So for me, looking around and seeing that all of a sudden, by the world's standards, we had nothing. What were we going to do? Now our life was an empty shell. Well, the house was, like you said, the house was an empty shell, but our life and our faith was, and we look back on those times now and we thank God that happened, because it guided us into a whole different direction. I went to the grocery store. I had no money. I had to use these government food stamps, these government issued, dollars. And the woman at the cashier at the checkout at the grocery store recognized me from seeing me on television. And she started, I remember you being pregnant. Oh, this must be the baby. And she went on and on. It was such an honor to meet you. It's so wonderful. And inside I'm thinking, I can't pay for this. How embarrassing this is going to be when I have to pull out these food stamps. And she went on, and finally she said, okay, it'll be $75. And I thought, okay, here it comes. And I pulled out the food stamps. And she looked at them, and she looked at me, and she had this disgusted look on her face, that I was the lowest worm of the earth. And she refused to look at me. And anytime I went into the store after that, she refused to look at me. And she would just kind of sneer and refuse to look. And I thought, what changed about me from one moment to the next moment? Absolutely nothing changed about me, but it was her perception of me, that I did not fit this ideal that she had created for me, this box for me to fit into. And it brought me to this new realization. And what was also interesting, when I left television, I lost all of my friends, or who I thought were my friends, because now I didn't have this status, job, or position anymore. I was just a mother. These people didn't want to have anything to do with me. So it was a huge time in our life that so many things changed, and our priorities shifted completely in an opposite direction. And it was all about, the culture's lying to us. We're happier now than we've ever been. We weren't happy when we both had jobs and money and that type of thing. So, maybe there is more important things in life.
Well, I think it shows also the importance of what your husband said. We have each other. Obviously, that hadn't changed with whatever. They'd take your furniture and everything else. That hadn't changed. You had each other. Whereas the false friends, now that you didn't have money, now that you didn't have status, now that you didn't have whatever they would perceive as getting some benefit from knowing you because you had these things, they said, well, we don't need you anymore. So it really wasn't that they liked you that much. It was just unfortunate.
Thanks a lot, Father.
No, but obviously you have your real friends. Your real friends that you and you grew in friendship with your husband. I'm sure you loved him then, but you grew in friendship because of all this as well. And you realized that and of course you had already had your priorities. You looked at your young son and you said, well, I've got to protect him. And so God gave you these instincts, to all women, I'm sure, but to give you the instincts of, this is your child, you're going to protect him against all things, all dangers that you possibly can. And those are the important things, I think. But now, you're looking back, that's some years ago now. How old is your son today?
At 19.
19. So in the past 19 years then, how things, they didn't stop there. They didn't stop with you with an empty house and the furniture gone and so forth.
No, actually my husband got a job with a very good company, and they ended up transferring him from Atlanta to Dallas, we live in the Dallas area today. And that happened, a couple of years later after that. So even though we started to make more money, we were much wiser with it. We were, much better stewards and far more charitable than we had ever been before. And he grew in this company, and I decided at that point when we moved from Atlanta to Dallas that I would never tell anybody that I worked in television. I would never speak of it, because I knew that people would be impressed by that. And to me, it was just a job. It was something I did. It was fun. I was good at it. You know, it was a good time. But other people had it in a different status. And I didn't want people to be my friend just because of what I did.
Yeah.
I wanted them to like me as a person.
Sure,
and like you
absolutely.
said, it was very true. You know, the people didn't like me as a person, but what they could get from me or my position or my job or the status of just knowing me, you know, type of thing. So we moved to Atlanta. We grew, you know, very much in our faith. It was a struggle to try to find a church still. I mean, there's still so much confusion of what is right, what is wrong, what is truth. You know, one Catholic church would teach one thing, and another priest at a different church would say something else. So we went through a lot of struggle with that as well. But thankfully, we knew our faith. We were, you know, what my spiritual director now says, we were, you know, error-proof. We had formed ourselves enough that we knew that if we heard somebody say something, we go, no, that's not true. I can look it up in the Baltimore Catechism. No, that's not true. I know where to look for it now to find the truth. But my husband grew very much in his faith. We had a number of miscarriages, but I had 3 more children, so now we have 4 living children. And it wasn't until a few years after that, one day, a friend of mine, we were at a play group, and our children were playing on the floor in front of us, and she was talking about how she was an F-16 fighter pilot, and how she used to be in the United States Air Force, and how she gave all of that up to be a mother. And I found it very fascinating, and I was asking her lots of questions, and suddenly she realized she'd been talking nonstop for half an hour, and she said, oh, but enough about me. What did you used to do before you were a mom? And I said, I was a television star. And she laughed. She goes, oh, Colleen, you're so funny. You know, and we've just moved on. Well, a couple of years after that, I was at a conference out on the West Coast. It's actually the same conference I was at with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand, who ended up being the woman who tell me to write the book, Dressing with Dignity, the book that I wrote a few years ago. I was at this conference, and I had promised I would never tell anybody unless they asked. This woman sat down next to me at lunch, and she said, so, tell me something about yourself. I said, well, I'm a mother of 4. And she said, no. Before you did that, what did you do? And I said, I worked in television. She said, oh my goodness, I'm here working for a radio station covering this conference, and my radio host got sick and can't make it. Will you take his place? And so I gradually kind of got it back into that, talked to Dr. Alice von Hildebrand at the same conference, and we started talking about these issues of femininity and modesty and how Marxism and the idea of communism has destroyed the family. And I said, oh my goodness, you should write a book about that. You know, talking about femininity and talking about modesty. There's no books out there on modesty. And she said, oh, no, nobody's going to listen to a little old lady. With your background in television and modeling, you need to write the book. And so I went to a chapel, and because I didn't want to write a book on modesty especially. I mean, who wants to write about that, you know?
Right.
That doesn't sound fun. And I thought, okay, if God really wants me to do this, he's going to have to make it very obvious to me. You know, give me a 2x4 and make it obvious. I'm open, sort of, but, you know, make it obvious. So I knelt down and I was praying, and so I looked back on the pew and I saw this book sitting in the pew, and it was the 40 Dreams of Don Bosco.
Yes.
And I thought, okay. So I opened the book and I just flipped the pages. I said, speak to me, Lord. Give me a sign, you know. And I opened it up and I just blindly put my finger down as a spot, and I looked down and it said, in matters of modesty, there are no sins that are not mortal. I went, ooh. Okay, best 2 out of 3, God, best 2 out of 3. And I flipped it open, I did it again. Again, it was another issue on modesty. Third time, another issue on modesty. So I thought, okay, I guess this is what I need to do. So I went home and started working on a book on modesty.
And you published that today. Of course, they can get that from our station here, from our program. But you know, Our Lady came at Fatima and spoke about. I'm sure you know the story. This Fatima was what got you started, I would say. But Our Lady spoke about modesty. She said that certain fashions would be introduced. I've always thought of that terminology, would be introduced. You know, that fashions didn't just happen. It's not that, well, today we do this and tomorrow we do that. No, fashions are introduced. They're introduced, which would offend, or the finisher's lady statement. Certain fashions would be introduced which would offend our Lord very much. So these fashions are introduced by the enemies of God, by the devil, and also by people who work for the devil, whether they know it or not. These people, they have these fashions come in which cause people to sin. Now, some people say, well, how can that possibly be? But we could perhaps talk about this in another program. But the whole idea is that obviously the devil knows what he's doing, and these fashions are used in order to cause people to sin. Our Lord said, if a man were to look at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her, then he's already guilty of the sin that he's thinking of doing, even though he hasn't done anything. I mean, not done anything physically. He's done something already within his mind. But obviously, as St. John Chrysostom asked the question, he says, who is more guilty, the person who drinks the poison or the person who serves him the poison to drink? And St. John is talking, what is the poison? Of course, is that you're drinking the poison of sin through your eyes by looking at a woman immodestly dressed. And I mean, you can hardly avoid seeing them, but at least you can either turn your eyes away or change your subject in your mind or do something. But if if a woman's dressed that way, and you're not disciplined in your mind then it's easy enough to fall into sin. And yes, both are guilty. And the one who serves the poison is more guilty, I would say. However, both would end up in hell if they don't repent and don't forgive. But it's very topical, the subject that you've written. And yes, it's a very boring subject, but I can tell you, for a priest to talk about it, I can tell you, I still remember being before 2 bishops and a priest, and all I had was a little leaflet. And all the leaflet said was what the Vatican says you must do to dress modestly. And I just left it. I didn't even talk about it. I just left it on the table. And it was in 7th grade classes, and these girls picked them up. They brought them home, and one parent picked it up and said, "Oh, this is terrible." This bishop actually yelled at me for having this modesty in dress leaflet, which has an imprimatur on it, by the way. He yelled at me, just amazing. So let me tell you, it's not just boring, it's absolutely hard to deal with. But we'll have to talk about another subject, another program. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Colleen. It was very interesting. God bless you.